first of all, I want to say Happy Father's Day, Grandfather's Day, Great-Grandfather's Day, and all the fathers here, and even the one of those that might not have been fathers. I don't think we have any of those here, but anyway. And I want to tell you, if you came back today to hear more fish stories, because that's what we heard last week, you're not going to hear any fish stories from me. Oh, I forgot that. Sorry about that. And I have a pretty ordinary life, so it's not going to be too entertaining either. So just have to. It is what it is. I was born in 1956, the youngest of 5 children. And as Rick said last week, I guess I was an oops because my sisters and brothers are all quite a bit older than I am. They were living in an apartment building that my grandparents owned, a 2-bedroom apartment. The girls shared 1 bedroom, my parents had the other, and my brother lived in the dining room. And then when I was coming along, they needed more room, so they moved to a house. It was about a block away from one of the big lakes that are in Madison, about 2 blocks away from a river that connects the lakes. So a lot of my childhood revolved around going down to the lake and swimming off a pier, or having swimming lessons at one of the many beaches. Ice skating in the winter, of course. Wisconsin's known for their winters. And the toboggan run was not too far from my house, and so there was a lot of things to do that way. My brother dragged me one time when I was pretty small out onto the lake in the winter because it would freeze and be very safe to go onto. But he wanted to go to the other side of the lake. And so he took me when I wasn't very old, I don't know how old I was, with him. And the only trouble is you get out to the middle of the lake and you it's not a lake like Home Pond or something, it's a big lake. And you get out to the middle and you can't tell one shore from the other, especially in the winter. But we went ahead and went all the way across, but then it was getting so late that he had to call my dad, who didn't know that we had done this. And my dad had to come and get us, so we didn't have to come back across the lake, because you wouldn't really know where to aim for when you're coming back. So we did a lot of things in those days that I would never consider letting my grandchildren do today, but anyway. I have 3 sisters and 1 brother. I had 1 brother. My brother was right in the middle, 2 girls on each side of him, so he was kind of outnumbered. I lived in the same house for all my years until I left for Graceland, and my mom and dad continued to live there until I had my kids and brought them home there. And then my dad had passed away, and my mother decided to downsize and move to a senior apartment. And so my 2 sisters, who live in Madison and still do, helped her get rid of all 50, 60 some years of stuff and move into an apartment. Let's see. One of my sisters lives in Des Moines, and that's my oldest sister. She had come from Boone. Her husband was a dentist in Boone for all of their married life, or a lot of it. And then they needed to downsize, so they didn't have a yard and house to take care of, and they moved to Des Moines to be closer to one of their sons and their 2 grandsons that live there. Let's see. My brother served in Vietnam. He was a writer for the Stars and Stripes newspaper. And he returned to the U.S. and worked as a newspaper writer and editor. And a lot of it was in eastern Iowa, around Iowa City, Amana Colonies area, and smaller papers over there, until he developed multiple myeloma. And they attributed that to his exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam, and even though he didn't serve in active battle. So the last years of his life were spent in the VA hospital in Knoxville. And he he died in 2004. My mom, Clara Miller Sweeney, was the third of 5 children, 2 boys and 3 girls. She was born in 1921, and she was the middle child. She was the only one of her siblings that went to Graceland from 1941 to 1943. And then she returned to Madison and worked, took some training and worked as an X-ray technician. She stopped working to raise her children, but when she was raising her children, she was working at home and she was also taking in kids and babysitting. She went back to work when I was in 1st grade in order to send her kids to Graceland, because my dad, in his background, did not see the necessity or need for sending your kids to a private college in another state that costs a lot of money. So she went back to work, and when she went back to work, she was a radiotherapy technician, which is a little related to the X-ray technician, but a step on. She treated people with cancer, and she worked at the University of Wisconsin Hospital, which was a research hospital, and so very busy. And at one point, they were trying out this hyperbaric chamber that they thought was the answer to treating cancer at that time. And what it did is it was kind of like a scan machine where they slide you in, and then they pressurized it with pure oxygen, and it was supposed to do something. Anyway, that worked for a long time, but at one point something happened and the whole thing exploded.
Oh, gosh.
And luckily, the technicians went behind a screen to avoid the radiation that came from the machine, and so she didn't get any,
Wow.
But the doctor, and I don't know why he was in the room, maybe they hadn't really gotten it started yet or something, I don't know. He did suffer some injuries from it, and I don't know, broken jaw, or I don't exactly remember what, but anyway.
But the patient wasn't in it?
Patient was in it, yeah.
And they were okay?
They had a collapsed lung or something like, they had some injuries, but yeah. So anyway, and my dad, Charles Raymond Sweeney, was born in 1921 in Boston, Massachusetts. And he died of cancer at the age of 66 in 1987. My dad came to Madison with the Army Air Corps and was stationed at Truex Field in Madison. And my mom and my grandparents lived somewhat close to the airfield at that time, and so she and her older and younger sisters used to go over to the social events on the base. And there was a dance there or something, and that's where she met my father. He was trained to be a radio mechanic, and he was sent to serve in the war, although he didn't serve in active combat either. I'm not exactly sure where he was stationed. I kind of think Hawaii, but not sure.
World War II?
Yeah. And she stayed behind with her first child, my oldest sister that lived in Des Moines, Kathleen Tucker. And after he finished with his service duty, he worked most of his life for the post office in Madison, in one of the windows inside, selling registered letters. But at times, because he had 5 children and my mother wasn't working, he would work 2 and 3 jobs and work something on the weekend or whatever. His mom, my dad's mom, was Catherine Kinney, and she was born in 1880 in Roscommon, Ireland. She died when she was 51, and he was 10 years old. His father was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts, but I know his family had to have been Irish immigrants with the name of Sweeney. And he also died, died when he was 54 years old. But there was a time from the time his mom died when he was 10 until he was about 16, his father was living. And none of my sisters seemed to have any idea what happened to him or why he didn't keep the family with him. I suppose in those days that wasn't as common, but my dad was, and maybe a couple of his sisters were raised by nuns in an orphanage for a while, until some of his sisters got old enough, I guess, to have him come, and then he was raised by his sisters. He was born one of 8 children. He was the youngest, and all those 8 children came in about 20 years' time, but I suppose that was pretty common in those days too. I really only ever remember meeting about 4 of them when I was real small. But I knew 2 of his sisters the best, the 2 that raised him. Let's see. It's suspected that his parents may have died of TB. And I know that he had a very difficult early life. He never talked about it much, but I know it wasn't an easy life, being 10 when your mom dies and all that kind of thing. So that wasn't something he talked about a lot. Eventually, my dad did join the church when my brother was baptized, but he was never really a very active member. Sometimes it was because of those 3 jobs he was working, but even when he wasn't working 3 jobs, he would only come occasionally. When I was fairly small, my mom would try to get me to go in and sweet talk him as he was laying in bed sleeping. And sometimes it worked, but I caught on to that pretty quick, and then I wasn't going to have anything to do with that anymore. I figured if he wanted to come, he would come, and if he didn't, he wouldn't. So, but he did have, his own kind of affection with the church, as he aged. But my mother and my grandmother were the people who nurtured my early church experiences. My mom's mother was Leah Lampman, and she was from Porcupine, Wisconsin. Yes, there really is a place called Porcupine, Wisconsin. And actually there was a church there, and I went and visited it once. I don't think it was open at the time, but it was still standing, and so we went there. Let's see, she died in 1981 at the age of 88. She lived a good long life. In her last, probably 15 years, she was legally blind from glaucoma and things like that. So a lot of times I would read to her. They didn't have books on tape and books for the blind at that time, so I would sit with a cassette recorder and read things into the cassette recorder so that she could have her daily bread every day, and things like that. And I would drive her places when I became 16. I would take her to the grocery store, and of course she wanted to go. She didn't want just me to go and get the stuff and bring it to her. She wanted to go, and she needed to pick up everything that she was wanting to buy and make sure she checked it out first. So it was kind of a slow process. I did house cleaning for her and things like that. Let's see. She also went to Graceland. That's what this is from. Now I don't know if that is from when she was there from 2012 or 1912 to 1914, or if that's something that she picked up after she came back.
There's the true gold they talk about.
Yeah.
The Graceland gold.
A lot of moth holes in it too, so you can tell it's got age. But or whether she picked it up at a homecoming after that, I don't know, but it's old. So. And she studied secretarial science, because that's what you did back then. I guess she worked as a stenographer just when she got back from Graceland until she married, but I don't ever remember her having a job outside of the home. She worked hard in the home, but not a outside paying job. She used to come to Graceland on the train, stay all year, and then go home. And I have a picture, actually I have several pictures, of her at Graceland, the train station at Togo, a picnic at the North Lake, and the people who were in charge of the children's home at that time. So I will pass those around. My grandmother is the one on the right in both pictures, the top two pictures. She was always a very faithful church member, women's leader, piano player. Her piano is in my home, waiting for Jessica to have room to move it to her home. She gardened, she sewed, she knitted, she crocheted, she read, she worked in the church. When she had her 50th wedding anniversary, my mother wrote this about her mom. She said, her character can be told immediately simply by talking to her and having her near them. She need not make resolutions to try to help everyone because she has done this for so long, it just becomes a habit. That's my mother. Now my grandfather was Frank Miller, and his mother, I'm not sure where he was born, I don't have a lot of information about him. His mother was Clara Steinstrom Miller. She was born in 1867 near La Crosse, Wisconsin, near La Crosse. She was motherless at age 9, a bride at 18, and a mother by 20 when she lived in Bayport, Michigan. And Clara was brought into the church by J.J. Cornish. Her husband Jacob hated the early church, but she got baptized in the winter when there were 18 inches of ice wherever she was getting baptized. She got baptized in spite of him anyway. So, my mother's grandmother was Minnie Shedd Lampman. The Sheds and the Lampmans lived next door to each other in Porcupine, I guess, and so she married one of the Sheds. And the Sheds go way back in family history, clear to England, and I have lots of information about the Sheds because they've done a lot of research, but I'm not going to go there. And the Lampmans' country of origin was Germany, and I have a booklet of information on them as well. Like I said, my mother and my grandmother were a great influence in my life. Wait a minute. Oh, here's my family. I'll pass this around too, and then Paul can show the camera. This is my family when I was 3 or 4. The older kids were going Christmas caroling. And then this is the same family when I got married. And so you can see how they've grown and changed. Oh, and I'm getting a little out of order here. Here is my mom and dad on their marriage. And
This is your brother?
yeah.
That looks like your son.
Oh. And then my mom in her apartment that she lived in after she moved out of her house. So I'll send both of those around.
Doesn't that look like Jacob? Doesn't her brother look like Jacob?
And then there's one of my grandmother Leah, my mother's mother and her husband at their house. And so I'll pass that one around. Sorry I didn't get those in the right sequence with my talking, but anyway. Let's see. As I said before, my grandmother, mother and my grandmother were a great influence on my life. We were at church whenever the doors were open. I'll just mention this as kind of a random thought, but my first Sunday school teacher was Clayton Henry's wife. Clayton Henry was the basketball coach at Graceland for years. He was studying at the university to get his math degree or whatever. And so they came to our church, and she was my first Sunday school teacher, but I guess I wasn't very cooperative because at that time I was not used to other people just because I stayed at home with my mom all the time. And so I did a lot of crying, but she put up with me anyway. And this is kind of jumping back and forth, but I'll mention now that several of the people who influenced my life had a big impact on them that the question asked about later are mentioned in my story. And one of them is a Sunday school teacher. I'm not sure she was ever my Sunday school teacher, unless she was like a substitute teacher when someone else had to be gone. But today in Madison, she's still teaching Sunday school at 85 years old. She loves it. That's her ministry, and that's what she would rather be doing than anything else. And this summer, she even plans to travel to Minnesota to the Headwaters reunion to teach 4- and 5-year-olds at reunion. So she is something else. And I was mentioning my sister last night because I asked her how old she was, and she said she doesn't look like she's 85. She says she just you know, like
85's getting old.
yeah, kind of an Energizer bunny. Okay, well, first of all, Madison has had over the years 3 or 4 church buildings. The first church building we were in, my grandfather helped build, and it was not too far from our house. I don't remember much about it. I know it had a wood stove in it. It's no, it's not. It's one of 2 that are still standing. It's actually been changed into a house. And my sisters went back there to take a tour, asked the people if they could go in and see it. They said the basement looks just the same as they remember it, because they used to have classes in the basement or something. Then we moved to a church close to the lake, and that was a wonderful church. We had a lot, and that's where I was baptized. But eventually they wanted to build a road across the lake, a causeway, and they said it was going to come too close to our buildings. We should not have our building there. So we sold the building. And unfortunately, that was a mistake because the road didn't come too close to the building, and it would have been a perfect place for a lot of visual exposure. You know, it was just right there, and it became lots of other businesses and things over the years. Now it's gone. And then we met in the YMCA while our new church building was being built, and it's the one they use today. It was built when I was probably in junior high or something like that. But anyway, back to the story. I couldn't wait to be baptized. I couldn't wait till my birthday and I would turn 8 years old. And I was baptized by a man named Stan Hunt, and I have a picture of me being baptized. I was always wanted to be involved in things at church. When I became too old to attend Bible school, I immediately wanted to teach at Bible school. And I had people who allowed me to do this, and so I taught crafts. When we were building this new building that they're in now in Madison, I wanted to help. So a very old gentleman, older than my grandparents, let me help paint beside him in the interior walls. I went to all the camps and reunions and retreats, and I served as a camper and a counselor at many camps. And at that time, Graceland didn't have Graceland reps, but I thought it would be wonderful to be able to just go from camp to camp all summer and do that. And in my church, Marion's sister Evelyn was one of my Zioneer leaders with her best friend Mary Beth Rickenbach at the time. They were teachers in a small town nearby Madison, and they came into church and were my Zioneer leaders. And I don't know whether it was before them or after them, also I had Charles Curry and his wife as Zioneer leaders. Then as Zion's League leaders, I'm not sure of all the leaders, but we spent a lot of time at Donna and Georgine Albro's house because they had kids my age. In fact, it was one of the things when Evelyn's Evelyn was our Zioneer leader, there weren't very many of us, and I was kind of complaining in Sunday school one day that there just wasn't, trying to encourage my cousin and this other kid that came to Sunday school, that we needed to be there and support each other and whatever. And just about that time, 3 families moved to town, and all 3 families had kids. And Don and Georgine Albro were one of those families. They had 3 kids. The Carpenters, who are former presiding patriarch, Jane Carpenter, Jane Gardner was one of these kids that came to Madison, although I think she was older and had gone off to Graceland, but there were lots of them. And then another family had 3 or 4 kids, and so all of a sudden we had a big church group. There were big groups ahead of me, older, and there were some groups younger, but my age, there just wasn't really a lot of kids. So I was really happy when all these people came. And Georgine and Don Elbro opened their home, and we hung out there a lot, and that's how we all became a very cohesive group. And church was really my social life. I was also involved in Girl Scouts. I took piano lessons. In high school, I started playing the French horn, and by the way, my son played it for a while. Now my grandson is playing the same French horn that I played. And of course, at that time, that was a big expenditure for my mom and dad to go out and buy me a new French horn, so it's gotten a lot of use and they would appreciate it. I've also always enjoyed sewing and creating art. Let's see. I went to Graceland from 1974 to 1978, at first not knowing what I wanted to major in. And then, because I took the first winter term off, which was really frowned upon at that time, I volunteered at a Head Start in Madison, and that's when I decided to go into education, because I'd always gotten along well with kids. I started having nieces and nephews when I was 12 years old and was called upon to do a lot of babysitting and things like that for them, so and then I got into that. One of my roommates at Graceland was Dee Jones, who lives in town here, married to Terry. And she introduced me to many of the religious life groups on campus. I started going with her to the Indian Ministries Club. And because of that, I went on a winter term to Chinle, Arizona with Paul Lucero, to the Hogan Church, where Ron Livingston and his family were living and ministering at the time. I also went at least 2 summers on the NACAT team, and I went to places Oklahoma, Arizona, Wisconsin, Ontario, different places, and that kind of took the place of me wanting to go from camp to camp as a Graceland rep or whatever, because I did that.
What's NACAT?
A Native American Cultural Appreciation Team. It was something that the church had going at that time. And after I graduated from Graceland, I had really no plans, and I didn't really want to go back home, even though I love it there. And I would probably, that would be my go-to place to move to if I didn't live in Lamoni. But I just didn't want to fall into the same habits and routines that I had when I was living in Madison, so I decided that I would apply for a teaching job on the reservation at Chinle, and I was in the superintendent's office. He had a contract ready to hand me to sign to be there, but it was at that camp that I met Mitch, and so he convinced me that I shouldn't stay there, that I should come back at that time to Missouri to see where the relationship went. And so he had come there that was his first time there, and he had come there with some other team members, George Galusha, Dan Knotts. There were several others, Gary Goodfellow, there were several others that all went on this camp. So I went back to Missouri, and he introduced me to his niece, which happens to be Laura Hayton Crowfoot, that's in our congregation now. See a lot of times on Zoom. I don't see her there today. And she had a house with another young woman in Independence. And Laura was hardly ever there because she worked kind of as a resident home person with handicapped people. And so her bedroom wasn't used very much, so she said, sure, I could stay with them. And so I lived for a year with Laura, and I got a job at an insurance company in Kansas City, working as an account clerk for a year. And then we got married in 1979. His parents, which were Vera and Marge Blakesley, then became part of my family. And they had a mobile home between Pleasanton and Lineville on family land. I'll pass that one around. And they were wanting to move into town again. They moved a lot, so it wasn't unusual for them to move from place to place. And they wanted to move into town, and so their mobile home was going to be open, and we moved into it and lived there. And then it just happened that somehow I heard that there was a teaching job open at Lineville, which was only 8 miles down the road to the east. And so I went and applied for that job, and while I was interviewing, I mentioned that my husband had been an art teacher, and they said, oh, we need an art teacher. But it was only a half-time job, so they lined him up to be a electrician's assistant with this guy that worked in Lineville. And so half the day he taught art, and half the day for 1 year he went and helped this guy do electrics. And then the next year they hired him full-time, and he taught art and social studies, which at the time, if you had a K-8 certificate, you could teach any subject. So he taught social studies, and he liked history and things like that, so he did a good job with that. Let's see. He also drove the bus there. So Jacob was born in 1982 while we lived in this mobile home outside of Pleasanton. One night I was up correcting papers at midnight, which wasn't an uncommon thing. And Mitch was in bed, and I was sitting there at the kitchen table under a light that was there, and I kept smelling this smell. And I thought, well, is the light just so dusty that the heat of the bulb is making the dust smell or what? I kept smelling the smell, and finally I decided I maybe should wake Mitch up. And I woke him up, and he was concerned, and we ended up calling the fire department, which had to come clear out from Leon, which was about the farthest point you could get in Decatur County, but that's where the fire truck had to come from at the time. And so, and somebody, one of the firemen, they were about to leave and say, no, just turn your breaker off and go back to bed, there's nothing, can't see anything. And this one guy took a flashlight, pulled the paneling away from the box, and held his flashlight out and saw a smoldering of smoke. And apparently the ground wire had broken or something, which allowed, So if they had left and gone away, we would have been in a bad way, because of course you know how fast mobile homes go up in flames. And Jacob was a baby in the crib at that time. He didn't even wake up through this whole thing, but anyway. But after that, and of course then Jessica was going to be, we wanted to have a second child and knew there wasn't going to be room in that mobile home for 2 kids. So we made the decision to move to Lamoni, and where we were blessed to live next to Joyce and Lester for many years, and I still live in that house. It was a hard decision. It wasn't hard for us, but it was hard for some people at Lineville to understand why we were moving to Lamoni and not that way to Lineville. But, even before we started teaching there was this rumor, Lineville's going to close, Lineville's not going to be open very long, Lineville's a small school, it's not. And we didn't think it was fair to our children, because I know I personally would have expected more from my own children than I expected from everybody else's children, which some of them would say was probably a lot, but anyway. So we wanted them to be free to grow up with not having their mom as a teacher for 2 years, their dad for a teacher every year, because he had them in art every year. And they didn't have much of a music program at Lineville, and we wanted our kids to be in music, so we moved to Lamoni, and we got kind of a lot of flack for that, because some people took that personally and thought, no, you shouldn't, you know, you're not loyal to Lineville because you're moving that in a direction. But we taught there, I taught there 32 years, so I guess we were pretty loyal.
Yeah.
And Jacob just loved going over there and playing basketball against their group, and even practicing with them if we had a day off. And he always went over there and spent the days, or both kids did, when they had a day off and we didn't, they would come to school with us.
So what year did you move to Lamoni?
Let's see, probably 85. 85, yeah. And we attended church first in Pleasanton, then in Leon, because Mitch's parents lived there. It seems like we were always running to town. I mean, there was nothing out there in the country, and we were still young, and we wanted to do things, so we would come either to Lamoni or to Leon. So we started going to church in Leon, and that's where Jessica was blessed. And then we started going to church in Lamoni because so our children would have more children in their Sunday schools classes and have more people to be involved with. Mitch was very active in Boy Scouts with Jim Jones, Bob Farnham, Dan Boswell, Dan Knotts, Carl Larson, and many other dedicated leaders. He was a muzzleloader and attended rendezvous with Nancy Sherman's husband, Kim. In fact, Kim happened to be one of Mitch's roommates at Graceland. So, yeah. He also liked motorcycles and old cars and fixing things he found at garage sales. In his younger years, he was part of a music group called the Emporium. Mary Ann Manuel was part of that. You'll remember the name Larry Jordan. They toured around. That's why it took him more years to graduate from Graceland than it should have, because he was on tour a year during that time. And the kids at Lineville all loved him as an art teacher, and he did unusual crafts. They featured him in the paper once because he would have the kids chipping arrowheads and making arrows and sewing things out of leather. And one time a kid who had been on a wheat harvest with his family over the summer brought in a rattlesnake skin. And so they used that rattlesnake skin and they made it into a hat band or something, you know. He was always doing unusual things. So he was very popular. And of course art is a popular subject, so you know, he was the fun one. I was the one that had to make them learn to read and do math and write and all those things. So I was probably not as popular as he was. But when Jacob was a senior at Graceland, between baccalaureate and graduation that week, Mitch passed away suddenly from a heart attack. It was 2005. And Jacob went ahead and went through graduation. In fact, they asked him to carry one of the flags there. And Jessica was just finishing her freshman year. But that was quite a turning point in my life, and the support we all received from church family and from community members, both in Lamoni and also in Lineville, where we were teaching, was remarkable. I remember getting to the hospital, and it wasn't too long after we got there, and I suppose it was because Dale was a sheriff or a police officer then. Here comes Marion with several of the Graceland students in, and they just kind of surrounded Jacob and Jessica and, you know, just helped them through that time. Let's see. And then afterwards, of course, this had been in the works because Jacob had been in the Older Youth Service Corps, had served a summer in Detroit, and had come back to finish his senior year or whatever at Graceland. And Bob Kaiser stopped him at World Conference and asked him to go back to Detroit as a church planter. And of course, that was a very difficult time because, of course, Jacob had never lived anywhere but Lamoni, and even the people in Detroit were questioning, how is this kid that's, rural Lamoni ever gonna reach these people in the inner Detroit? But he did a wonderful job. He trained with Jimmy Munson in Chattanooga for a number of weeks before he actually went off to Detroit. But after Mitch had died, I thought, I don't want my son to leave and go, to a dangerous place, because they had holes in the windows at that church where gunshots had gone through there, and I'm thinking, no. But there wasn't, as an art major, he didn't have a lot of options, and he really wanted to serve the church, so he made that choice, and he left, and he went and served as Detroit church planter for several years. His wife now, Rachel Goodson, had 1 year left at Graceland, so she stayed and completed her senior year. And then she joined him, and they lived in the dorms at Ann Arbor, because she then was working on her master's and served as a residence hall person there while she was doing her master's degree. And so he would drive back and forth and of course the church owned a house at the time right next to the church plant, but people told him he didn't want to live there. So the first place he lived was in something Hills, anyway, in an apartment for the first year, and then he moved into the dorm with Rachel after they got married. Because when she graduated, then they got married at Bluff Springs Campground, and she became part of the ministry team at Detroit Hope when she could. Since then, after she graduated with her master's, they returned to Pensacola to be closer to her family, and she was never a fan of cold weather or snow. And so she didn't like Michigan, she didn't like Iowa, so she wanted to go back where it was warm. And she worked as associate director of housing. She worked at Western Florida University at Pensacola for a while as a residence hall person, and they had an apartment there. And then she got an opportunity to be associate director of housing at Florida State at Tallahassee, and they gave her a chance to work on her doctoral degree at the same time, so they moved to a community 20 miles from Tallahassee. Jacob is a middle school art teacher, a Boy Scout leader, an active 70, and his wife teaches Sunday school to all their kids and is a high priest. In May, just this past May, she finished her doctoral program and graduated with a doctorate in higher education. And while she's working on her doctoral degree, she's raising 4 children, and they are also directing camps at Bluff Springs, which is where Rachel went to camp when she was a child, so that's where they go. But Jacob also serves as what's the term for it? He's the Mission Center 70 for the Deer Haven, the southern Florida area right now
We
too.
used to call it invitational ministry.
That's probably what it is, but anyway. Jessica was a music major at Graceland and graduated in 2009. She taught music for 7 years in 3 different schools, 2 in western Iowa and 1 in north central Iowa. And then via internet, she reconnected with another one of the Graceland music majors that she knew. And they started dating, and they were married 5 years ago in 2019. And they live in South Des Moines. She now is not a music teacher any longer. She had enough of the politics of education and the low pay and everything else. So she now works for Equifax in West Des Moines. And she's a manager there. And at first she was something they called a coach, and I thought, oh, how smart is it of them to hire an ex-teacher to be a coach of other people working in the business. But then the coaches were being trained to be managers, so then she moved into the manager position. So I have 4 grandchildren, all living in Florida. Levi is 15 and will be at spec for the first time this year. And just as a side note, Jacob, a year or so ago, said that when his first child starts at spec, he will have someone in spec for 18 years or something, because his kids are spaced just far enough apart. I think there may be 1 year in there that he doesn't have someone in spec.
They've been coming to spec for years.
Oh yeah, they've been coming, and he's going to be helping teach ceramics at Graceland at spec this year. So he will be around. I thought maybe he'd get to stay at my house and then just go out there, but sounds like they want him to be in the dorm as a counselor or something too. But he's going to come up a few days early to spend some time here, just 2 or 3, so it's not going to be much. His son wants to ride the bus with the kids, so that's what he's going to do. And he's going to bring the rest of the kids, and they're going to stay with me. Levi, well, his kids are, of course, grandmother's prejudice. But they are extremely gifted, and I keep thinking of the quote from Luke that says, as much is given, much is required. And so I think a lot will be required of those kids, because they have a lot of things going for them to share. Their kids are into music. Levi served as a delegate to the last conference, and he took 6 friends with him to senior high camp this year, which they all had a great time. So, and 3 of those kids went with him last year, and they helped recruit the other friends to go. So he said, Jacob says, no, they may not ever set foot in the church, they may never be baptized, but they will remember their camp experience. So I think the next thing is people that have influenced my life, and I've already mentioned several. The Sunday school teacher who's 85, the man who let me paint next to him when they were building the church, of course, Dee. But I can mention others too. Dale Duke, some of you may have gone to Graceland with him. He worked tirelessly directing camps and leading campfires when I was a youth, and he and his wife at Camp Oak Hills. And they even bought a bus, and they were teachers, and so they would bring all the kids from their town, which was small, Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, and they would bring 30 kids to camp with them when they would come on a bus. And and we had over 150 kids at our camp, senior high camp at Oak Hills. Of course, now Oak Hills doesn't exist because it dwindled and they didn't have the money to take care of it, and the church sold it. So it was located close to the Dells. So it was, but it didn't have a pond to swim in. We had to go off the grounds to swim. But another thing I remember is being a pre-teenager and going up there when they were just clearing the land and helping take down trees and build outhouses and things like that. And then our first camp was in tents, in circus tents. They would put up a great big circus tent for the main activity, and then a kitchen tent, and we would bring our own tents and stay in tents and have to take showers with a hose over it. This was like a survival camp is what it ended up being. And one time a thunderstorm rolled through and we knew we were going to get a lot of rain. So in the dining tent, they pushed all the picnic tables together, and one of us slept on top, and one of us slept on 2 benches, and one of us slept on top, and one of us slept on 2 benches. And we cooked all our own food that first year too, so that was a good experience. I would say Tom Moraine a big influence in my life. He gave me my evangelist blessing, served as a mentor along with Les Gardner when I received my call to priest. He also married my daughter and son-in-law. And I think that was one of the last things, big things. I mean, he did. I'm sure he did many things that I don't know about, but it was toward the end of his life that he did that. Natalie Anderson, and I can't really even explain why Natalie is a mentor to me, but she just has always just been a spiritual strength and rock there. And of course Peggy Henson, because she was a fellow teacher. She had my kids in kindergarten and then again in college. And so I asked her to be my mentor in my journey to finish the course for elder. And so she taught our class, Evelyn and I and Julie. And we just finished last Sunday, so, and of course my grandmother, and I could mention so many people. I mean, all of you sitting here are also people that have influenced my life a lot, so. Turning points in my life, it's not a turning point, but I think my upbringing in the church was a big influence on my life. I don't think my life would have been the same had my mom and my grandmother just been in there all the time. I mentioned the groups that I was a part of at Graceland. It wasn't just the Native American group, but there were several church groups on the time, Andover Zion Builders and Service Corps, and there was several. I mean, that was a time with lots of different groups that drew lots of students for enrichment in their spiritual journeys. And I would have turned out differently had I not connected with those people. Not taking that job in Arizona and returning to Missouri and eventually marrying Mitch. And I think many times about how different my life could have been if I'd have taken that job and stayed down there all by myself. And I thought, man, that would have made really a big difference. And of course, when Mitch passed away, and then, of course, my call to the office of priest was another turning point in my spiritual journey, and now my call to the office of elder has caused me to rethink my service and to my community and to God. So, how has my impression of God, or my understanding of God changed over the years? I don't think I ever feared God or put him on a high pedestal so that he was unreachable. He's always been a friend to me and someone to turn to all the time. My understanding of God, yes, I was born in the age where there was one true church and we were going to build Zion and we were all going to gather to the same place and all that kind of thing. So in that way, things have changed, I think, for the better. I remember in junior high having a Sunday school teacher in Madison, and he was a good teacher. I'm not criticizing him in any way, but one day we youth decided that whatever he was saying, we had a lively discussion about it because he was the one true church kind of a idea, and all of a sudden it started dawning on us that, does it mean all these other people are not going to have a play, and so we really, and I think it kind of affected him, but I mean, we weren't rude, but we were very, vocal about our questioning, and yeah, it was kind of hard on him, I think, but, let's see, yeah, that's me when I was about 3 or 4.
You
So
show
yeah.
that. Pass that around, it's cute.
Yeah. I know that I'll never have a complete understanding, but I know that God loves me and everyone else equally to me, and he forgives us in our weaknesses and wants us to strive to be closer to him. I know that when I was my first year teaching at Lineville, I was driving home. Mitch was working electric, so I was riding with another person that actually lived over by Nine Eagles and she would drop me off at home and then go on home. And we were behind a tractor, and the tractor didn't notice, I guess, we were behind them, and turned right in front of us, and we hit the tractor, and it took the whole top of her pickup off. And we were not hurt other than I had a cut on my head.
Oh my gosh.
And I remember just before that happened, asking God to be with us. And so I feel like I can ask anything of him, and I know he helped me through the times when Mitch had passed, and when Jacob was away, and I was fearing for his safety. So I can pretty much, he's my friend, and I can ask him about anything. Trials, yes, I've already talked about some of them. Another one would be when Jessica was a junior in high school. I was diagnosed with colon cancer and had to have a colon resection. And that was a trial because my mother was still living then, and my brother had already passed away by that point. And I was just thinking, it's not fair for my mother to have to bury another child. And also that my children still needed me. I had, things to do. But thankfully, because of God's grace and because they caught it early enough, I guess, and I had good doctors, I made a full recovery, and they dismissed me, and so that's in history. And they were able to fix it and not give me one of those bags to wear around the rest of my life, so that was also good, since I was in my 40s, I believe, when that, so. And basically, the last two questions, and I don't remember what they are, but.
Just happened to have them.
Yeah. What experiences have kept you active in the church, and how do you live out your faith in a way that exemplifies God's love towards us? Basically, those are kind of the same answers. My purpose in life is to serve others, to serve my neighbors, and I use that real loosely. Mitch always called everybody his neighbors, if you remember that. Hi, neighbor. And even if he didn't live near you, that's what he called you. And anything that I can do to aid someone else's journey to have a better life here on the earth, that's what I want to be about. I want to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And that's what keeps me active in the church. And like I said, I always think of that Bible verse, not only for my grandkids, but for my children and for myself. To whom much is given, much will be required. Since God has given me so much, I'm required. And I feel that that's my service. So that's the end.
That's perfect. Janeen, it's very, very obvious that God has been with you throughout your life. I've known you for a long time, and you were always quiet, but very, very capable. And I am so overjoyed that you are taking such a leadership position these days. You are strong, you are full of strength, and a wonderful role model, and so involved in so many things. And I'm just so, so delighted to see that side of you and to know that you are in service of your Heavenly Father. It's wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
Joyce and I
Yes.
had great neighbors.
Yes.
So I just want to say, the one thing that really impresses me, Janeen, is the way your family, from before you, clear down, Jake is another example, are so missionary minded. And your kids have remained as faithful to the church. That doesn't happen to all of our kids.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so I've always been and have increasingly felt blessed to have you as a friend. Thank you so much.
You said your life wasn't in